Willy de Bakker here. I'm the moderator of a 3-day conference here in Brussels on climate change, as you might know, and we're very pleased to have you here. I hope I didn't drag you away from a meeting with President Obama there, but I think we're very happy.
This is my high.
We're very happy to have you here. We have in the room around 100 journalists coming not only from the European Union, but also from China, from Peru, all the parts of the world, basically, having listened to already 2 days of interventions from the European Commission. There are also some Americans here, quite critical about what happens in the US, and I think you would like to say a few words about that. So I'll leave you the floor for maybe 10 minutes to begin with, some ideas that you would like already to develop, and then I might come with a few questions, and I'll ask some of my colleagues to ask a few questions afterwards. Is that okay?
That's wonderful.
Okay, great.
I'm not sure whether Great. I don't know whether I'll even need the first 10 minutes because I would like to get into the discussion. Yes, and to the questions. I think from the perspective of the United States, everybody can appreciate right now that the U.S. remains trapped and essentially paralyzed. As we've been on any national scale policy really since 1994. The Senate has not taken, in my view, one constructive step on climate since the treaty was ratified. And this isn't changing now, and it's going to be even more difficult after next week's elections, because surely the political balance will swing against President Obama. How much is unclear, but he didn't have a majority now, and he's going to have even less of a majority after next week, and in fact could certainly lose one house of Congress and possibly the Senate as well. What does this mean? It certainly means that the U.S. will be allergic to any global agreements. It's impossible to send a treaty to the U.S. Senate, and might be for years and years to come. The only thing on which American movement might be possible within the United States is alternative energy sources, mainly around the theme of energy security and reduced oil dependence, as opposed to climate, though climate might be an ancillary benefit of some of the steps taken. But the big push in the United States is likely to be the development of natural gas deposits out of the shale gas. These are large deposits. There are very big economic interests behind the development of the shale. And I think a lot of public relations and lobbying effort will be devoted to tremendous expansion of natural gas development under the rubric of clean energy. Cleaner than coal, yes, but still a lot of carbon dioxide ahead. And so there will be probably a lot of pressure to move to a more natural gas-based economy, given the Marcellus shale and the oil fracturing, the hydrofracturing, which has become very popular and financially promising for investors. But we could see, even in the midst of the oil spill disaster in the Gulf, American public opinion tended to favor continued deep ocean oil drilling. American public opinion was against the cap. And even within the region of the Gulf itself, which was the impacted region environmentally, there was overwhelming support for continued drilling because of the oil and gas interests and the sense of jobs needed to be created. The U.S., of course, is a fossil fuel producing economy, whose strongest political interests are fossil fuel producing companies, whether that's coal or oil or gas. We have lobbies here which have carried the day for decades and continue to this moment to carry the day. We have some modest progress in solar power with new projects announced and approved in the Mojave Desert, which are good projects. We have some investments in electric vehicles, which are worthwhile. But generally, I would say we're more or less paralyzed on taking any major steps, major plans, major strategic actions. The status quo is very powerful. Congressmen that voted for cap and trade are going to lose their jobs next week. And this is going to mean that the administration will come to Cancun with very, very little indeed. Now, the U.S. is also allergic to giving money to other countries, except for wars, I'm sorry to say. But for purposes of development or environment, the United States people see no use to give money to poor people or to other countries. And so when we try to assemble climate financing, the U.S. remains pretty much against any clear actions. And it was not so hard for Secretary of State Clinton to endorse $100 billion from somewhere, somehow, by some mechanism in 2020. But getting a penny out of that today would be pretty darn near impossible. So big numbers in the future that are fairly empty and meaningless are not so hard. Anything that has a specific mechanism attached to it is probably impossible. And again, Obama doesn't command a majority vote probably in either house on these issues. And so he's unlike a prime minister who speaks for a government. He can only speak for the executive branch, and he can't actually deliver right now. So this, I think, is the U.S. reality. The global reality follows quite a bit from this. If you look at China, China is a booming economy that, in addition to major investments in low carbon sources, is also making major investments in carbon energy. And so I think when we look at the actual unfolding of China's energy policy, we're seeing major expansion of nuclear, solar, wind, and other renewable sources, but we're also seeing major expansions of uses of gasoline and therefore imported petroleum, and major expanses of coal. And I believe that both of those will continue. In other words, we're going to see significant and serious investments in non-fossil fuel energy, but I think we're likely to see also a continued rapid growth of carbon emissions from China, with China increasing the gap with the United States becoming more and more the front runner of global emissions in absolute numbers, though of course not in per capita terms. China's position on climate has been legally correct in my estimation, which is that the Framework Convention holds the U.S., Europe, and Japan as having lead responsibility, and have all non-Annex I countries not having to make commitments. Of course, the economic and geopolitical reality since 1992 is very different, because 18 years onward, China really should play a bigger role. China's view has been, though, after you, the United States, and the U.S. Is not leading and will not lead. And so we have this continuing dilemma of the two largest, most important economies in terms of climate change, I think not yet in a position, not yet actually turning the direction decisively on carbon emissions. I think this is the underlying reality. When it comes to Europe, Europe has without question the most serious climate policy of any region in the world. Europe is also enormously vulnerable to global climate change, so the stakes in Europe are very high. I was just in Athens this past weekend for a Mediterranean climate change initiative launched by Prime Minister Papandreou and Prime Minister Erdogan and other neighbors in the Mediterranean region. And I think it's undeniable that the Mediterranean is under really an existential threat over the next half century, because all of the climate models project a significant drying of the already dry Mediterranean environment. This is not a small thing in my view. I think the quality of life of Spain, of Italy, of Greece, of France, and so forth is at stake. And of course, that means the quality of life of all of Europe is at stake. And so Europe has been quite serious about this, but with the deep economic crisis and European businesses saying, why are we the only ones bearing this burden? The politics of this will become more and more fraught. And of course, we have the post-2012 challenge looming really in an absolutely direct way. Will Europe continue with the European trading system? Will it continue with the Kyoto framework when clearly it will not be joined by the United States in that framework, nor by China? These are very big questions, and I don't know the answers to them at all. I'm not sure that anybody really knows the answers to them, because the balance of political forces and judgments are probably still to be determined. What does it mean for Cancun? It means that there is a hope to decide on a few practical matters, as you know, perhaps the avoided deforestation agreement, perhaps a series of technology centers, which is coming under the rubric of technology transfer, but is a kind of baby step in that direction, in my view, not really a decisive step. And there's an intention to do something on climate finance. I have my real doubts on climate finance because I can't quite see who's coming to the table right now. Maybe Japan is, maybe the European Union is. I can't imagine the United States really being at the table. And a lot of what's called the fast start money isn't either fast, nor is it really starting, nor is it really new, and nor is it really available in any obvious sense, because what countries are doing is reprogramming their existing aid budgets and relabeling it as climate, and mostly in a bilateral manner, meaning that it doesn't really exist as projects. It's just a notional headline right now, and turning it into projects could take years of time. So there's a great difficulty of the international process because of this. Mexico is fighting a very bold and honorable effort to make the most of Cancun. President Calderon is a very serious person and very determined to host a worthwhile conference, but he faces long odds because his neighbor to the north is basically saying don't do anything or almost anything. And I think it's hard to see huge enthusiasm coming out of the Cancun meeting. One of the goals of Cancun that I should also add, and then I'll stop here, is bringing the business community more into the process. This is much needed. The normal climate process is led by diplomats who are very nice and honorable people who have a capacity to spend a lot of very polite time negotiating over specific words, but they are not operational, they're not business people, they're not management, they're not technology experts. And so the whole intergovernmental negotiating process is flawed, in my opinion, because it doesn't get to real things most often. It remains at the high diplomatic level, which is one of the levels that the world needs to act upon, but only one of several. And the hope is to have a more pragmatic line of attack that can continue over the next few years. And part of that is bringing the business community, especially large business, which holds a lot of the pivotal technology, to the table to get engaged. The Mexican government is working on that as well. I applaud that effort. I hope that somehow that gets institutionalized as one of the outcomes of Cancun. You can hear from my voice a certain weariness because we will go on for some years in a very unsatisfactory way right now. We don't have the leadership. We have a hole in the middle of this issue caused by the United States. That gap has been there for many years, and it's not being filled, and it's not going to be filled right now. If China were to stand up and say, we don't wait for the United States, this is too important for us and for the rest of the world, and we join all the rest of the world in searching for pragmatic solutions, and whether or not the United States joins, we're moving ahead. This, I think, would be the kind of breakthrough that could work. I think the odds of it are small, but it is possible that the world just does a work around the United States, and then the United States would come eventually back to the fold. And that, I think, is the best scenario that we can hope for. Let me pause here and turn it back over to you for discussion and questions.
Yes. Thank you very much, Professor Sachs. I think you paint a pretty gloomy picture there, although with a few glimmers of hope in terms of getting the business into the process. I think that's one interesting aspect, and the other is that China might take the leadership, and then the US will feel more obliged to follow there. I also see that you have some skepticism about the UN process. Do you see a kind of an alternative forum where we could get maybe business and others around the table? Is there an alternative to the UN process?
Well, I'm a part-time UN official, I should also be clear, as an advisor to the Secretary General, so I'm a big believer in the universality of the UN. And I deal day-to-day with diplomats, so I like diplomats also. But they cannot do what we ask them to do. I just went through the Millennium Development Goals Summit, which is more my area of UN responsibility. And I, of course, after many years, came to a certain realization. We had a final outcome document of that summit, which was September 20 to 22nd. It was negotiated in an intergovernmental process by diplomats. It's a very nice document about the Millennium Development Goals. It leads to no action by itself. It is what it is, which is an intergovernmental statement. If we want action plans, we need something very, very different. And I do believe we need action plans. And I believe that the diplomats that we have around the table are not capable of making action plans by themselves. They're not technical people. The design of the process is legalistic rather than investment, business, and action-oriented. And so I would supplement the diplomatic part of the legal framework with some practical, hands-on, sleeves rolled up, timetables and specific modalities for major economies under the UN framework. But we don't have that working right now. And I believe it is a failure of many, many UN processes that they remain intergovernmental diplomatic processes where what we need are technical and economic processes alongside. If we had an international organization for the environment, analogous, say, to the International Monetary Fund, the old idea of a World Environment Organization, we get further than we can get right now. Intentionally, the UN Framework Convention Secretariat is a small secretariat which facilitates intergovernmental negotiation. It doesn't make numbers, it doesn't produce studies, it doesn't make action plans for consideration. And I think this is a missing piece of the global system myself.
Can I come back to the role of business that you mentioned? I know that some businesses, big multinationals in the US at some point, were taking a step forward, getting into climate coalitions, et cetera, et cetera. Do you still feel they are behind this, or are they kind of also getting skeptic about the whole thing? We had a story here in Europe yesterday from a climate NGO coming out with proof that actually some of the businesses that have over the years said that they are taking leadership on energy and on climate change, lobbying to make sure that the US wouldn't take any cap-and-trade system. That kind of was a bit of a shocking story to us, that companies in Europe who were supposed to be more in terms of leadership, some of the leaders have apparently now taken a different approach there. Do you see that business is still behind the climate approach?
There are many different aspects to this, and it's a complicated picture. And of course, I don't know if any of us is really in all of the right rooms to get the full story. But first, there are some hard-elbowed, very tough vested interests that are fighting tooth and nail against doing anything. We have a major oil industry and a major coal industry, which is basically trying to block cap and trade and lobbying hard, campaign financing to a large extent, and a lot of propagandizing of the American public about the job losses and profound difficulties of abandoning coal or deep ocean oil and so on. And many of the congressmen who voted for cap and trade are finding the whole campaign right now against them directed at their vote on cap and trade, that they betrayed their district, that they betrayed jobs in the coal sector, and so on. So I think that first one starts out with that very strong interest group. ExxonMobil has been part of it for a long time. The Coke industries have famously been identified as very heavy financiers of anti-climate change legislation. And there are many, many more who are playing, and the coal industry itself playing that role, as well as the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. All grossly irresponsible, in my view, but a political reality. Then there were a coalition of companies, generally the big technology companies, the utilities producers, and the utilities themselves, who said, okay, we're ready for a clear framework. We can do cap and trade as long as we get the permits initially, as long as we don't have to buy them. In other words, if you make the right transfers to us, we'll support a gradual transition to a low-carbon economy. That group is within its interests to do that, of course. And I don't think that it's really disappeared, although it's abandoned any practical effort right now because there is no prospect for that in the Congress. There was, in my view, a third aspect to this, and that's a technical issue as well as a kind of political economy issue. I personally am not a fan of cap and trade. I believe that it is a cumbersome process designed for two main reasons. One, to avoid using the word tax, and second, to facilitate trading activities by Wall Street and by banks. And so I would never have gone down the road myself of recommending a cap and trade system for carbon. I would have gone with carbon taxation and technology regulation and feed-in tariff systems. Europe has ended up with a mix. It's got carbon taxation, it's got feed-in tariffs, and it has the European trading system. It has the ETS because the US pushed it to Europe. Europe adopted it, and then the US said, oh, no, thank you, we won't join you. If I were in Europe's position right now, I would try to simplify matters by moving to carbon taxation and to feed-in tariffs and pretty much scale down the trading system per se, because I don't think a lot more is gained relative to a strategy of carbon pricing, regulation of high carbon technologies, and feed-in tariff structures, which accomplish the same with less rigmarole, lower transactions costs, more predictability, and I believe more public understanding. So this is probably an unpopular view in Brussels, but I think it's only to say the U.S. is not going to join a trading system. I think the chance of this is very, very small, zero, I would say, over the next 2 years. But I think very small in general because it's been on the table since 1997. And for 13 years, the U.S. has declined. And Obama didn't come close, in my guess, to getting there. Who knows how many votes they really had, but I would guess it's probably around 45 out of the 60 practically needed. So my view is that they went tactically with the wrong political approach. Now, there's one more thing, which is only an inside U.S. matter, but President Obama has never put forward an energy plan for the United States. I think this is another mistake because without a plan, it's hard to rally political support. The whole administration strategy is not to explain what to do, but to negotiate with key interest groups and to hope that you find a narrow majority by giving away enough concessions to different groups that you get the 60 votes in the Senate without ever explaining to the public very clearly what this is all about. That's how healthcare was dealt with, and that's how climate was dealt with. When I went to the White House and I recommended that you need a plan, I was pretty much rebuffed, saying, no, we don't make plans in the U.S. We negotiate legislation, which is a different thing. And I believe this is a very big weakness of the U.S. political system right now, the absence of any clear plan. 2 weeks ago, we hosted a delegation from Denmark of a new plan to 2050 to reach a zero carbon economy in Denmark, based largely on wind and on biofuel. But what I liked about it was a commission that had been set by the government. It established a 40-year plan, and then the government broadly endorsed it, saying now we'll try to put this into operation through legislation and a legal framework. We don't have any process like that in the United States right now. And this, I think, is another reason why the process is failing.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to turn the camera now to the journalists in the room and see if there are any questions from the room. I already see some hands on the other side. So if the micro works.
Hello.
Don't hear the mic here.
No, is this working?
No.
Can you hear?
Yeah, it's fine.
Very well.
Okay. I work for a daily paper in Portugal. My name is Ricardo Garcia. You said that there is a hole in leadership that, and from what you said, it seems that you don't believe that the European Union can fill this hole. So what do you think that the role of the European Union can be? Is the European Union forever sort of sidelined as a leader in this process?
It's a very tough and good question. There are clearly three dominant players right now, and then the rest of the world that cares a lot about this. But there's the U.S., there's the European Union, and there's China are the decisive players right now. Copenhagen was essentially the U.S. and China saying we're not going to do very much. And certainly we're not going to do anything that binds us or that requires, in the case of the U.S., a Senate ratification. Europe was left on the sidelines, in essence. Tactically, Europe, I think, made one mistake, and that was to suppose that Europe's trading system would become a world trading system. This was the real hope of the Bali plan of action from the European side, whereas I think it was never a realistic one. But Europe, to its credit, has been by far the most serious region to understand the issue, to model it, to take policy actions, and to call on the rest of the world to do more. And so I think Europe, and I mean the institutions of the European Union as well as the separate countries, deserve a tremendous amount of credit, though it has not yet reaped any significant rewards for Europe. I think the only strategy, actually, that Europe could follow, other than taking care of itself, is to try to bring China, and of course to a lesser extent India and Brazil and other emerging markets, under the UN auspices to a kind of agreement that did not include the United States, first off. China's interest in doing that would be that the climate risks for China are really profound. China's an extremely vulnerable country, not only a major contributor to climate change, but a very vulnerable country to climate change. I urge every political leader that I can to speak straight to the United States, both to the public and to the leadership, that this paralysis in the United States is unacceptable to the rest of the world. That by itself won't unlock this, but I believe that sweet-talking the United States is a misunderstanding of our situation right now. The United States is the outlier country. It is the least common denominator, even more than China, because China has at least the legal right to say what it says, which is after you. Whereas the United States does not have that claim. It signed a treaty which is international and U.S. law to do something which it's not doing. So I believe that the U.S. actually poses the most significant barrier to effective action in the whole world on this issue right now. And I think the world should say it very clearly. I have to tell you, on the other hand, that the Wall Street Journal will laugh. It will mock the voices from abroad. It will use that in a nationalistic way to say, you see, we're on the right track. Those Europeans hate us. That can only mean good news for the United States, and so on. This is how weird the situation is right now. But it is the reality, unfortunately. And we need to take it into account in thinking about this, because the truth is the planet could care less about these politics. Nature doesn't care. Nature is just experiencing the annual rise in carbon concentrations, and we need to find an effective way to head that off. And we haven't found that yet.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Sachs, for being with us and giving this contribution to the journalists around here. We have to move on to another debate, but if it ever gets too difficult for you in the US, you're always welcome in Europe.
Thank you very much.